Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Steven.
And I'm Daniel.
Gavin Ortlund did a video that has made some waves about the Council of Nicaea II, arguing that the cult of the veneration of images within the church is clearly an accretion. So our goal here today is to do a little bit of a response video to some of the points that he brought up, and to present kind of our argument and our view of Nicaea II, hoping that it'll be helpful for people and actually move the conversation forward. We're not looking to do like a tit for tat kind of video. But before we get into that, I just want to say, if you really like the content that we're putting out, be sure to like and subscribe and support our efforts here. We are doing our first 500 years series. For those of you who maybe haven't tuned into us before, where we're running through the first 5 centuries of the church. What are we? I think, Dan, we're on 40 something episodes in that series, and I think we're only in the mid-2nd century. So there's a lot of content there for you to grab onto, and we do hope you'll support us. So
Click the bell for notifications too.
There it is. I knew there was a third thing they had to do.
That's always my part. I have to say that.
So the background to this is that I was actually going on a business trip. I was driving up to Minneapolis, kind of minding my own business, and then
which, by the way, we do have secular day jobs.
Right. So I'm driving up, and then I see on one of my friends' Facebook pages this video from Gavin Ortlund, and I had 6 hours ahead of me, so I figured, why not? So I gave it a listen, and I'll tell you what, it was a well presented video. I mean, for especially coming from a Protestant side, Dan. I don't know. I mean, what did you think? What was your initial reaction to that video?
Very, very fair, very balanced. I was actually surprised because he's a pastor of a Baptist church, I think.
Yeah.
I was surprised at how well he was able to navigate the scholarship, his fairness to the sources that he was reading. Balanced, well presented. His zeal was well placed as well. I mean, there's moments where he's gets worked up and passionate, but he should get passionate about the truth, as he says. I thought that that's all good and well. And frankly, I thank him for the video, because we should always be testing the spirits. And it's good to have a lively debate. If there's something that's concerning you about a doctrine of the church or a practice of the church, then let's address it, and let's rethink it, and let's defend it.
Yeah, and listening to him too, I felt it. I felt him, like I because I know what that felt like when I was a Protestant, and the points he was making, like a lot of the arguments he was making were actually arguments that you and I, Dan, would make when we were Protestants. A lot of the same, primary sources and things like that. So, and I also know what it feels like to have a quote unquote ecumenical council anathematizing, people who hold a certain position. Then you see yourself holding it, and you're like, come on, and I know what that feels like, to feel like you're back up against the wall, kind of thing. So I do appreciate that it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't polemical or anything like that. It was a genuine and heartfelt and well studied presentation.
Well,
so,
well studied.
Yeah, and so I do thank Gavin for that and for his efforts, and I do look forward to anything else that he's going to be putting out on it. Now that said, I do want to say, why don't we start with like what his argument actually was? Okay, so the argument being that icon veneration is not apostolic practice. It's not early patristic practice, and it's not just not early patristic practice. It is ubiquitously not patristic practice, and it is actually spoken against by the patristic fathers. So it's kind of like 3 walls are knocked down, in his view. And so then he says that by the time you get to the 6th century or the 7th century, you definitely start to see a shift leading up to the Council of Nicaea II, and finally Nicaea II kind of codifies something that he says all of the early fathers would have condemned.
Yeah, it also hangs the argument on scholarship that would say that the veneration of icons is something that dates to the 6th and 7th centuries only, and that Nicaea II codified an innovation in the church.
Yeah. Yeah, he does give you the impression that that's the unanimous consent of even like historiography. So we'll say that. But so I was online and I was following the conversation on this, and I was leaving comments too, with some really great names like Eric Ibarra, Suan Sana, and so on. So while I was leaving those comments, there was really some really good engagement back and forth. And so as I was leaving those comments, I kind of felt like, even though we're kind of in our first 500-year series, we're currently dealing with women's ordination in the early church, But I felt like, okay, there's something here. We might as well, do a video and try to.
And you forced me into it.
Yeah, I arm wrestled Dan into even doing it. But we're going to do it. So I did respond to one guy who kind of, after he read one of my really long comments, was kind of like, okay, so you're basically just going to do the Catholic thing then and just relegate this to doctrinal development, even though it's clearly a U-turn, as Gavin says, and then, walk away feeling good about yourself. So I responded to him and I said, well, let me try to put this into a nutshell. So I'll just kind of like read that comment and then I'll maybe kind of get us going. So,
yep.
All right. So I said to him that, okay, at Nicaea II, there's no doctrine being promulgated or developed. Nicaea II, this is a cultic question between two parties who share the same cult. So we have to remind ourselves that this is not a Catholic versus Protestant council, obviously. So while there are maybe parallels to what happens in the 16th century, this council is a question within the family, within the same cult. So like if you're a Protestant, like trust me, the iconoclasts are not your friends. The more you look into the iconoclast position fully and who these guys are, these are not your friends. It's one of those kind of handful of moments in church history when Christological developments turn and influence the cult rather than the other way around. We're kind of used to, in church history, the cult guiding the development of theology. But in this case, it's the development of theology that then goes back and informs the cult. So if I could put the question of the actual era of Nicaea II succinctly, it would be this. This is the question that the Council Fathers are asking. Can images of Christ be admitted to the existing cult of veneration, gospel books, crosses, relics, saints, in light of the Christological developments of these past 6 ecumenical councils? Okay, so that's the question at hand.
I think that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's a beautiful presentation on exactly the question that they have to answer.
It's the
It's
question
very precise.
The question is very precise. Okay, so the iconoclast answer to that question then is, not only is it a hard no that images can't be admitted to the cult of veneration, which we also practice, but we're even going to go a step further and start removing these images altogether from the churches. Okay. The Fathers of Nicaea II, their answer was, absolutely, these images can be admitted to that. The ancient images not only are going to stay, but they're going to be able to receive the same outward gestures of piety that any other object in the cult currently receives. And any argument to the contrary serves to stifle rather than to promote the flow of the evangelical apostolic tradition. So that's the nutshell version of what we're going to argue. So, no.
Now we got to try and show that.
Right. So, no, this isn't an instance of like kind of the stereotypical Catholic apologist, like, oh, it's doctrinal development, kind of like the dumpster diving into doctrinal development.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What I hope what we humbly do here is to actually show the grades of cultic development, because I think that was one of the things that was missing from Gavin's analysis.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because at the end of the day, our view is that this is actually a wholesome and very reasonable meeting between the church's apostolic tradition of painting images of Christ and then venerating holy things within the cult of the church on the other. Right? So any objections to this in the previous era of like the fathers, the early era of the fathers, this is the thing. It's either not directed at fellow Christians, and therefore it has a specifically pagan context that we have to look at, or the arguments against it were framed in excessively Platonic and or rabbinical terms. And both of those views increasingly become unacceptable in the light of the councils of Ephesus, Chalcedon, and Constantinople too.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to what we would mark out as kind of the major... There's some major omissions in Gavin's presentation. And I think that's where our argument actually would begin, is kind of a context around some of those omissions. So, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but in his episode, I don't think he ever even mentions Saint Athanasius.
Yeah.
And if he does, it's in passing, perhaps.
Yeah.
Saint Athanasius is not spoken about. Curiously, Platonism, no in-depth, mention of Platonism is there. Actual pagan ideology of idols, what the actual pagans believed about their idols, that discussion isn't there. Islam, I don't think he mentioned Islam in the context of the Islamic takeover of the Eastern Empire and what kind of impact that might have had on the consciousness of the church. And then also, you kind of were alluding to it in the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon and Constantinople too, and that is the ongoing sharpening of the church's Christology in the communicatio idiomatum, so the communication of predicates. What can be said of
we'll talk
Father
about
can
that.
be said of the Son and whatever.
Yeah.
So none of those, I guess, 5 major things were really mentioned at all, and that appeared at least curious or suspicious to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think overall, my first initial objection, like you're pointing out when I was listening to Gavin and when I had finished this video, was like, there was a lot of context missing there. Even with like a lot of the quotes he was using and stuff, I'm like, man, there's more meat to that bone, than
well, I'm sure he keeps mentioning in his book. I'm sure maybe there's more depth there, but
yeah, but like you said though, he didn't really go into the pagan ideology of idol, which I think is like essential if you're going to be dealing with some of these aniconic texts of the early fathers. I felt like his presentation made you think that this was like merely some intramural Christian debate about like what the Bible says or like what the apostles did, rather than like a much larger question that was historically pressing upon Christianity from forces outside as much as there were things bubbling up inside, But this debate about the place of image in religion, we know it spans all kinds of cultures, empires, religions across the ancient world. This wasn't something that Christians for the first time were dealing with,
Right.
Yeah. So like, for instance, four other ideologies that were missing from this debate were, like you said, the pagan, the image, where the images are in potency the body of the gods. Whenever the god would choose to incarnate in the idol, that's what it was erected for. Then there's the philosophical position. So this is position number 2 that's in the air, and that's that God is incorporeal, right? And because he's incorporeal, images are useful to commune with the gods, to interact with the gods. Now, there were some philosophers who would go as far as to just say God is incorporeal, so I don't really have anything to do with idols. It's useful for like the ignorant, for those who need that stuff. But we who are educated don't need it,
Sure.
the third view that's missing, that we spend a lot of time on in our channel for the first 500-year series, is the rabbinical. That images are didactic only, so it's like didactic use. And we'll talk about maybe I think a little bit there, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. So and then fourth, the final thing that's in the air, especially in the lead up to the Council of Nicaea too, we can't forget is the Islamic view that images are completely forbidden. Especially in cultic use, right? And the Christian iconoclasts are sounding like Muslims, right? So that's also, when you're looking at like the anathemas and things like that, you have to remember too that the heat of this era is not just informed by the iconoclasts versus the iconoduals. It's also like the church is looking at Islam and it's seeing the destruction of Christian culture from one city to the next,
Yeah, so really at Nicaea too, what's happening is that you have these four general outlooks on religious images, I suppose, as the historical context. What Nicaea 2 is doing then is they're giving the fifth answer, a particularly Christian answer to cultic images and what we do with them. Right.
Yeah, and as we'll go through, they're clearly at Nicaea 2 drawing upon apostolic tradition, to avoid any of these extremes, But okay, so missing context, that was one of my first reactions. What were your thoughts on maybe his overall treatment, of the text of Nicaea 2?
Well, I think it was a slight misread, because when you go back and you read Nicaea 2, which again, Gavin's episode, maybe go back to my bookshelf and take it out again and reread it. I'm always struck by how simple it is.
Yeah.
There's a precision there to the language. It's a simple declaration, and there's no claim within the text itself that, oh yeah, the apostles venerated icons, and therefore we do too. Mm-hmm. And that's a claim that is kind of implied or intimated by Gavin in the episode, but it's not there in the text of Nicaea.
He quotes a part of it. He quotes a part of it, and it says in keeping with. It's the part where it says in keeping with the faith of the apostles. But it's taken out of context because literally in that paragraph, they're not saying they're talking about the faith of the previous councils. So they're not saying that the faith of the apostles, as in venerating icons, they're talking about the Christology that undergirds the practice. It's pretty clear, and I do know so when I was talking to a couple of people online, like Eric Ybarra, he brought up I'd be interested to hear what translation of the Acts of the Council that you're reading, but my thing is, all the councils have Acts, right? But the Acts of the Council is not what we look to find out what the doctrine is. That may be the rationale, that certain fathers are using, or a collection of fathers are using at a given time. But the definition of the council is really preeminent. That's what matters. So I would rather spend.
And you may hear it from modern Orthodox theologians or what, somebody claiming that. But again, that we're talking about Nicaea 2. Mm-hmm. And at Nicaea 2, that's not what is being claimed in the pronouncement of the decision.
Right. And I just felt like Gavin's treatment of the text of the Council of Nicaea 2 was very eisegetic. He was reading into it not only the kind of the polemics of the era, was he reading into the text of the council, but he's also reading later Orthodox theology and other things that Eastern Orthodox have said. He's reading that into the text of the council, but the council isn't saying any of that. So I think we just need to reframe.
And in part, he's doing it because he wants to be fair to their theology, which is great. But I do think you're right that there is a tendency to then, in the at least the listener's mind, to then equate that with Nicaea 2.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just to reframe the conversation, I just want people to get into their minds that Nicaea 2 doesn't say a ton.
Well, go read it. Yeah, go read it for yourself and see what you think. I think you'll see what we're seeing.
Yeah, the text of the council just merely says that the making of sacred images was an unwritten and perpetual tradition of apostolic provenance, right? Which the most recent epigraphic evidence and archaeological evidence is actually showing us that images go back to the earliest times that we can possibly have Christian archaeology. We have images immediately. It's it's not like there's aniconic churches and then all of a sudden these icons just explode in the churches. All the way to the house church, there's images. Down to the catacombs, there's images, even images of Christ. So for the text of the council, the veneration part is a development that is in agreement with the apostolic inheritance, right, of written and unwritten tradition. So the piety that it actually ends up recommending at Nicaea 2 is much more mild and wholesome, really, than what Gavin is kind of baking into the text. Mm-hmm. Think of it this way: like the apologetic texts that are even read out at the council or written surrounding the council, we know what those are for. And there was plenty of that on the iconoclastic side too. It serves to bolster enthusiasm, right? But the argument of the conciliar text is much more subtle, much more careful. Especially for the heat of that era. And think of it this way. It's much in the same way that some of the excesses of even St. Athanasius' writings are distinguishable from the actual texts of Constantinople I. It's like, because you think of like his disciple, like Apollinaris. He wasn't off his rocker to read into Athanasius' writings word flesh Christology, where Christ doesn't have a human soul. Because there's a lot of parts where Athanasius seems to be saying that, So again, you're not going to take Athanasius' writings that kind of get us to Constantinople I and say, well, see, that was the rationale, though. Well, it doesn't matter, because what matters is what's in the text of Constantinople I, right? Yeah. There was one other side note that Gavin asserted that the pre-Nicaea 2 fathers knew nothing of this distinction that Nicaea 2 draws out between latria, worship, adoration, and dulia, which we would say is veneration. So Nicaea 2 is the one that references that, and he says there is no distinction like that in the early fathers, because it's all about the act. What you're doing in the act is worship, right? But okay, that's pretty demonstrably not true. So like, okay, St. Augustine, when he was writing a response to Faustus the Manichaean, he said, quote, "What is properly divine worship, which the Greeks call latria, and for which there is no word in Latin, both in doctrine and in practice, we give only to God. To this worship belongs the offering of sacrifices, as we see in the word idolatry, which means the giving of this worship to idols. Accordingly, we never offer or require anyone to offer sacrifice to a martyr or to a holy soul or to an angel. Anyone falling into this error is instructed by doctrine, either in the way of correction or of caution." So right there you see he's making the clear distinction between what they're doing, which is latria, giving latria to something, and the pagans giving latria to something, and he's saying the distinction between that and giving veneration to the angels, to the martyrs, to the holy souls. So it's demonstrably not true. Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, as far as the text of the council, though, that was my initial feelings about it. The final thing, this is kind of stepping back, big picture. We'll get into the details of our argument, but my first initial reaction that I even texted to you was this whole thing about doctrinal development. This isn't an argument of doctrinal development. Icon veneration is a development primarily in the cultic sphere of the church. And we really need to emphasize that, right? Mm-hmm. as distinct from like a strictly dogmatic development, like the conciliar definitions of like Chalcedon, like, two natures in one person and things like that. This is a cultic development that is actually resting on those dogmatic developments definitions related to the Trinitarian Christological controversies of these previous 6 centuries. I would even say that those Christological clarifications were actually necessary before the church could even fully really think or respond to this whole idea of imagery within the cult of worship. I mean, yeah, it's just like the context of Nicaea 2, we just have to recognize this isn't written against your friendly Protestant pastor that lives 2 doors down 500 years after the Reformation, This is speaking to those who were actively removing images from the churches and breaking them, plastering over them, excommunicating their own faithful who had them.
Yeah. So you can understand Gavin kind of taking it personally, but it's not directed at Gavin, because Gavin's not going around smashing Catholic churches and Orthodox churches all over the place. The anathemas that are there are for those who deserved them
at the time. Yeah, exactly.
At the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you see the roots of that in the letters of Gregory the Great. He actually he quotes that whole instance to Severus, to Bishop Severus, where he had like come down really hard on his people and removed all the sacred images from the church. And then Gregory told him, he said, you shouldn't have done that. You can correct them, make sure they're not adoring these things, but you shouldn't have removed them. We've always had them. Right? So, yeah, I mean, to the Council Fathers then, that's why the iconoclasts are the innovators. They're the ones who are doing something new. Like, why are you plastering over images of Christ? I mean, like we said, going all the way back to the catacombs, we have images of Christ.
Right, and that is a big point. I think that you have to see the iconoclasts as the innovators, because for all of the aniconism of the early church, whether you're speaking of Clement of Alexandria or Tertullian or Justin Martyr or Athenagoras or whomever else, Origen, the fact of the matter is that images remained. And Origen wasn't going around, painting over images in the early church. Mm-hmm. So images were always there alongside the rhetoric and the hyperbole of aniconism among the early fathers. I mean, even Augustine, who is somewhat ambivalent toward images, he's not going around in his day, painting over images or knocking down statues or something. Yeah. So the innovation is that kind of zealousness. That is new to the church, and that's what the Fathers of Nicaea II were saying.
Yeah, yeah, because Gavin makes this claim about this can't possibly be a doctrinal development. This is a doctrinal U-turn, is what he says. Well, again, there's nothing about doctrine in this. The doctrine stuff already happened in the previous 6 councils. Mm-hmm. If you could compare it to something like when we're talking about a cultic development, I actually think there's a fitting analogy to the West's practice of Eucharistic adoration, and not just general adoration. That's always been there, I would argue, but the actual the practice of actually taking the Eucharist, putting it in a monstrance, setting it up on an altar for whatever 24 hours, 24-hour chapel with people keeping watch. That can look like a U-turn, right, in a way, because, well, wait a minute, like the fathers never did that. The apostles obviously didn't do this. You can even garner up some patristic quotes that like you ought not to do this, But if you're following the theological developments of the church's understanding of Eucharistic theology, eventually, it goes back and informs the cult, So once you get to this, like the stems and the shoots,
and then the cult says something about the theology.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you have to treat the two together.
Exactly. Like the stem and the shoots of the theology that is growing about the Eucharist eventually produces the cultic flower of adoring the Eucharist. In these settings. So, a cultic practice is not a raw instance of doctrinal development. In the same way as those which are strictly rational and theological, but the cultic development is always a reflection and an expression of theological developments, and so that's why they should be treated as package deals, you know?
Yeah. Which is
so
why
like,
you would question. Which is why you would question a Catholic who would come to you and say, "Oh yeah, I don't go to Eucharist adoration."
Exactly.
Because now you're saying something about the doctrine, of the church.
If somebody came to me and they said, and they're Catholic, and they said, "I don't go to Eucharistic adoration, man. I avoid that at all costs," I would immediately say, "You don't believe in transubstantiation?" Now imagine if like somebody who's not Catholic was listening to that conversation, they'd be like, how did he deduce that the guy didn't believe in transubstantiation because he said he wouldn't go to adoration? It's the same thing here. Like that's what's underlying the anathemas in a way, right? Because the Nicaea two fathers are watching these people break and destroy icons and say that you can't even have them. And their response is, but don't you believe that Christ is God incarnate?
Mm-hmm.
You know? So, you know, I mean, in the modern world, we tend to sharply distinguish between cult and dogma, but that's not the disposition of these previous eras of the church. You know, participation in the cult was this living and active participation in the teachings of the church, and the two are growing together from the same plant. And that's why I just find the Protestant commentary from like Gavin's side just void of historical context, like trying to get into the mind of the fathers. I don't feel like he tried to get rid of 500 years of our Western aniconism that is actually born of popular Protestant influence on our culture, you know, to try and really understand this era and how they're thinking and the doctrinal developments that are informing a lot of this, you know? So to me, it was like his presentation came off as like, you know, over an hour of not to be rude, but just a lot of historical anachronisms, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so those are kind of my, our really initial reactions to the video, just coming out of it, kind of broad strokes. But maybe we should get into some of the things that we think Gavin would really have to kind of contend with.
Well, yeah. Well, let's look at it as we normally do as historians, or historians of theology, because the burden now is back on us to show and demonstrate that this is a proper development in the cult of the church.
Yeah.
You know.
Mm-hmm. So there's three things that Gavin, I think, has to really contend with. Number one, the earliest churches and gathering spaces that we have preserved contain religious images. And not just fish and bread, images of Jesus Christ. Both as a man. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, obviously the famous ones are Jesus as the Good Shepherd, symbolizes the Good Shepherd. When I was in Rome, I got to go into the Scavi tour into the ancient necropolis under the basement of the Vatican, and in the one of the tombs that's down there, as you get closer and closer to where St. Peter's tomb is, there's this beautiful tomb with this beautiful frescoed domed ceiling in it, and at the top of it is a picture of Sol Invictus, the sun god, basically, with rays coming out of his head and riding on the chariot with horses. And it's a Christian tomb, the tomb of the Julii. And so it's not just symbols that are being used in early Christian art. It's images of Christ using pagan motifs, but almost in portraiture form, even in the early 3rd century. And so it's very striking to look at and see. It is the focal point of the room.
Yeah, it's there's a part in Gavin's video where he seems to be kind of insisting that religious imagery is permissible, but it's merely didactic if it's used for didactic purposes, which again, that doesn't quite agree with the people who are being anathematized at the Council of Nicaea too. But even there, you're like, okay, well then painting Christ as Sol Invictus in this kind of portrait form and not narrative form, as like, say, the rabbis did. When you look at the synagogue in Dura Europos, for instance, and you look at all the frescoes there, it's all narrative form. It's like bump, 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 like Moses, Red Sea, then to this, then to this, then to this.
And that's frankly how most of the catacombs are too. Mm-hmm. They're narrative, pictorial narratives that don't seem to really have a whole lot of rhyme or reason to them, right? So Noah's standing in a box, that's Noah's Ark, and then there's a guy over here with a sheep over his shoulders, that's a good shepherd, and they're kind of just almost mishmash. It feels like so. Yeah, there's. It's actually not even narrative. It's kind of semi-narrative. It's like a moment in time in a narrative. Yeah, it's not like the Roman Titus's column or something where literally the whole narrative is being told to you, on the column. That's actually curiously very rare in early Christian imagery. Is a full narrative of some story.
Yeah.
So there's guesses as to why that is. But the images that are there in the early church are there really all representing really one main thing, and that is Christ's ability, or the gospel's ability to bring salvation. So you get a lot of scenes of like healing or miracles, a lot of scenes about that show Jesus' ministry, for example. And so a lot of the images are showing forth the main general gospel theme of being saved from the lives they find themselves in, basically.
Yeah.
And there is the other thing too. I think maybe Gavin mentions how late even early Christian art is. So we see an explosion of narrative art in the 3rd century, no doubt. A lot of the catacombs date to the 3rd century, maybe late 2nd century. But there, oftentimes, scholars will point to this kind of suspicious gap between the time of Jesus up to when we see all these images in the catacombs or wherever. Which just goes to kind of show that this is how aniconic Christianity really was. And then when it starts to get into the pagan world, it then is showing forth itself in imagery. But one thing to keep in mind, and we often say it on our channel, is numbers. Always keep in mind numbers. The best guess, perhaps from Rodney Stark, at the turn of the 1st century, so around the time of St. Ignatius, there's only maybe 10,000 Christians in the entire empire. That's the size of one megachurch, one Protestant megachurch.
3 run-of-the-mill Catholic parishes.
Yeah, exactly. And so imagine those 3 run-of-the-mill Catholic parishes being spread out through a whole empire.
Cast around the empire.
There's not going to be much of a footprint for Christians to leave in the ancient world, especially when, at this time, they do not have their own buildings. They are still using either synagogues, or they're using a public space, a rented space, or they're still in a domestic space.
Right.
So they don't have buildings of their own. But so 2 things change as you move from the 2nd to the 3rd centuries. And number 1 is the numbers. So the 2nd century is sometimes referred to by scholars as the long century. That's because a lot happens in that century. That starts to show forth a church that is highly organized, that basically is getting its theology together. Its ecclesiology is there. Its sacramental theology is there. Everything is really showing forth by the end of the 2nd century into the 3rd, which is the topic that we're on now. But the long century there is numbers too. So at the beginning you have maybe 10,000. Let's double it to 20,000. Who knows? But by the time you come to the 3rd century, the beginning of the 3rd century, the best guess is now we're in the 6 figures. Perhaps 100, 200, 300,000 Christians in the Roman Empire.
Yeah,
And
Stark's Cities of God does a good job of showing like how that happened too, like how you can have such exponential growth, and it was because Christians, just for practical purposes, but it ended up being a gamble that made them $1 billion, was centering everything in urban centers.
yeah, so heavily urbanized, concentrated, but the numbers are there to now leave a mark. Number one, so you have catacombs
On the
filled
walls.
with bodies. You have catacombs filled with bodies now, and these are Christian catacombs. So that's important to understand. But also, by the end of the 2nd century into the 3rd century, Christians have already established themselves and have secured themselves to the point where they perhaps have more permanent settings, like the famous church Dura Europos. That was a house that they then converted into a permanent structure.
Yeah.
So we have to remember that persecution is sporadic in the early church. It's not consistent. So by the 3rd century, when you have large numbers, there are times, decades, in fact, where Christians feel fairly comfortable and they're not being persecuted. And so now, yes, they're going to leave a residue, so to speak. And so images begin to show up and be left on the historical record. In other words, the lack of early images does not mean that they weren't there. It just means they weren't left to us. And then all of a sudden they're there. I think it's a better explanation, right? Because it's not like images all of a sudden could have exploded in the 3rd century. They probably were always there, but we're just now noticing them.
Yeah, well, again, too, and that may sound to apologetic ears, that will sound like an argument from silence. But if you're in more of like the historian's mode, you can't ask of anything more of the sources. This is all you have to work with. Like, it's not practical to expect that a movement of only 10,000 people scattered across the largest empire, of its day, to leave a big mark after 2,000 years of dust, sand, and wind and weather. So it just doesn't work that way. So you have to wait, in a way, until the movement is big enough to really leave a footprint. There's a lot of small movements throughout history that we have no evidence of whatsoever, except like textual references here and there. They don't leave an archaeological footprint because it was small, So go ahead.
But I was going to say, even the development of new motifs, because Christianity has new motifs to show the world, and that takes time to find artists who could do that for you. Okay.
Right.
So there's just kind of just natural, gradual things to explain why there's this non-image world in the 1st and early 2nd century of Christianity.
Well, all the more reason why it's important to pay attention to when they are able to start producing something. What do they produce? That's important. It's the same thing with the question of the liturgy. What did early Christian worship look like? Well, it had to look at least something like what, or at the very least, the nascent early Christian worship had to work in such a way that it was pointing to what it aspired to do. So, like, once it's able to move into these bigger public spaces, and especially, in the 4th century when they're taking up these basilicas, now for the first time Christians are able to actually do what they want to do. In a way, right? and to really implement their cult. So that's when you do want to pay attention. And inevitably, in these ancient cultures, again, reminding our audience that this is not a time of fast-paced culture. Culture moves very slowly. It's oral. So to even say that we have 3rd century paintings of Jesus as Sol Invictus on the walls of a catacomb is a big freaking deal. It is a big deal because, again, culture moves very slowly, and so oral tradition and oral practice tends to be remarkably stable. And anthropologists have been the ones to show us this and to demonstrate this time and time again with all kinds of other cultures. The same standards apply to the Christian movement.
Yeah. And of course, obviously, Gavin knows this too. I mean, he knows there's images in the early church. But we say all this to just put to the forefront of our minds that that's on the ground, the context to now the literary evidence, the writings of some early church fathers, well, most of the early church fathers, and their aniconism. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know at one and the same time, Christians are producing images.
Yes. Yeah.
Even when some church fathers would say there shouldn't be any images at all.
Right. Well, and what it does is it confirms what Second Nicaea eventually says, which is that having images is apostolic practice. Okay, so that again, they're very savvy in the document. They're setting the stage. They're saying having images has never been a problem. It's always and not only has it never been a problem, it's always been a part of what we do. Okay, so and that's confirmed throughout the sources. Even Gavin himself, the sources he's quoting, and then of course like I said, we have all this massive archaeological evidence showing that images are always in the Christian churches. So having images is okay, and yet the iconoclasts, as innovators, are removing them and plastering over them. So just keeping that in mind, that there's innovation number one on the iconoclast side, Okay, so anything else on that first point that I think Gavin needs to kind of contend with? Or we want to move on to the next one?
No, yeah. Move on.
Okay. So the second thing that I think then, moving along with this narrative, the second thing he has to contend with is that the earliest liturgical and patristic texts that we have do show Christians robustly venerating things. Books, gospel books, crosses, oil, water, bread, wine, relics, holy places. So, and this is this isn't even for the iconoclasts even. This is not a controversy. Okay, like kissing crosses, kissing gospel books, venerating the bones of the saints, venerating their monuments, building churches upon their monuments. None of that is controversial. So as long as they weren't worshiping it, of course, but none of this is controversial for anybody. This is all part of the cult of veneration that's part of the church. So like my question to Gavin, if he's trying to use the Council of Nicaea to say, Nicaea II to say, this alone will make you a Protestant. You're like, okay, well, wait a minute though. Would you be willing to adopt in your Baptist church the veneration of all of these things? So it's like,
right.
Are you taking? You can't just take the side of the iconoclast for one specific issue and not take the whole thing. The whole, take the whole bite.
There's only two sides,
right?
And both sides venerate holy objects and holy places and holy people.
Yeah, I mean since time immemorial. I mean, I have in front of me actually like this massive list of quotations from the fathers. Talking just nonchalantly about venerating the bones of the saints, like venerating relics. I mean, going all the way back even to the martyrdom of Saint Ignatius. They say for only the more solid parts of his holy relics were left, which were carried to Antioch and wrapped in linen, a priceless treasure bequeathed to the Holy Church through the grace which was in the martyr. And then, of course, the whole thing over Polycarp's bones. There was this accusation on the Jewish side that they're going to take him and they're going to worship his bones. Obviously because they had seen that venerating the relics of the saints had been a thing for the Christians. And then the writer makes clear to say, yeah, but we're not adoring them. Like we don't worship the bones. We just pay the proper respect to them.
Oh, interesting argument.
Yeah, right.
Making a distinction between
Latria
worship
and Dulia.
Yeah.
Right. In the martyrdom of Saint Symphorosa, it says, after the persecution had ceased for 1 year and 6 months, it says, during which time the holy bodies of all the martyrs were honored, venerated, and deposited with all care in the tombs that we constructed for them. Okay. I mean, I can even post a link to a document or something, but I mean, I'm talking right in front of me right here. I have over.
But it's not just bodies. It's not just the relics of saints.
I'm just starting with
inanimate
the
objects
of saints.
Yeah.
Saint Jerome, everywhere we venerate the tombs of the martyrs. We apply their holy ashes to our eyes. We even touch them, if we may, with our lips, kissing the bones of the martyrs. None of this is controversial, For not Saint John Chrysostom, for not the bodies only, but the very sepulchres of the saints have been filled with spiritual grace. Okay. Don't even get me started on the Eucharist, the veneration of the adoration of the Eucharist, going all the way back to the Didache. Don't give what is holy to the dogs. Don't give this to just anybody, Justin Martyr, not as common bread or common drink do we receive these, right? But we receive it as the flesh and blood of Jesus. Now again, Gavin, in the Baptist church, when the Eucharist is over, when you guys are done with communion, what do you do with the leftovers? How do you treat them? Right? Are you in accordance with the unanimous consent of the early fathers and how you treat things, especially holy things? St. Irenaeus of Lyon, he says, this is no longer common bread, but the Eucharist, in Against Heresies, chapter 4, verse 18, 4 through 5. Tertullian, he says, we take anxious care lest something of our cup or bread should fall upon the ground. That's in On the Crown in 3 through 4. Origen, you see how the altars are no longer sprinkled with the blood of oxen, but consecrated by the precious blood of Christ. Homilies on Joshua 2:1. Homilies on Exodus. He says, when you've received the body of the Lord, you reverently exercise every care lest a particle of it should fall, and lest anything of the consecrated gift should perish. How is it that you think neglecting the word of God is a lesser crime than neglecting his body? And it goes on, Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian of Carthage.
I'm waiting for Cyril of Jerusalem. You didn't put Cyril in there?
Yeah. Oh no, he's in here. Yeah. Let's see which one's good. In approaching, therefore, come not with your wrists extended or your fingers spread, but make your left hand a throne for the right, as for that which is to receive a king. And having hallowed your palm, receive the body of Christ, saying over it, Amen. So then after having carefully hallowed your eyes by the touch of the holy body, partake of it, giving heed lest you lose any portion thereof. For whatever you lose is evidently a loss to you, as it were from one of your own members. For tell me, if anyone gave you grains of gold, would you not hold them with all carefulness, being on your guard against losing any of them and suffering loss? Would you not then much more carefully keep watch, that not a crumb fall from you of what is more precious than gold and precious stones? So they're venerating the Eucharist at the very least. So, like I said, these quotes are ubiquitous and unanimous, to use Gavin's words, when it comes to the veneration of the Eucharist, and it's straight through from every father. I'm literally my fingers going like this. I'm still scrolling through every single quote of an instance of them venerating the Eucharist. But also the veneration of crosses. Okay, so right as early as Minucius
as early
Felix,
as the second
right?
century, yeah. The implication there is Minucius Felix relates in Octavius 29:6. Well, there's a charge brought against him that they worship crosses, and he says, "Well, we don't worship crosses." And then he goes into an explanation.
Right.
The implication there is that pagans are seeing something that Christians are doing that they're associating with worship. Mm-hmm. So it could be that the Christians are kissing a cross, recognizing a cross, honoring it, adoring it, putting up in a high place, whatever it may be. They're doing it.
I love it because he's like, no, you do.
Right. Yeah. And then, but it's in the context of also Tertullian, because if it was just that isolated incident, it'd be like, okay, well,
right.
What can you really grab from that? But it's in the context also of Tertullian. We find the same thing in his apology. What chapter is it?
No, it's actually it's in on idolatry. On idolatry,
okay.
Chapter 5 is where he. I think I have it here in front.
No, I thought it was apology. It's apology 12, where Christians are accused of worshiping the cross, and instead of Tertullian saying we don't worship the cross and then go into explanation, he says, "Oh yeah, actually, you worship the cross too, and you're one of our co-religionists, basically." Because then he goes on to explain how idols are actually made with there's a cross shape, a wooden cross shape within the figures themselves. He says, "So really, behind your idols are the cross too." So again, it's in these sources. The implication is there that Christians are adoring or venerating the wooden crosses.
So I thought you were talking about on idolatry when he's talking about the bronze serpent.
Oh no.
Yeah, because in there, again, this is on idolatry. So he's writing against the idolatry of the pagans, and he says that there's objections that might come, and one of them is, well, what about the Israelites bowing down to this bronze serpent in the wilderness? How's that not idolatry? And it's funny because
he says it was a figure of the cross.
Yeah, he says, well, yeah, but it's a figure of the cross. So the implication, of course, being that it's okay to bow down to the cross.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and then once you get to
Tertullian.
Love Tertullian. And well, actually, you know what? That is significant that it's North Africa too, because North Africa is a rigorous form of Christianity. So if you were looking for like something that would be like a very aniconic church, I actually just off the top of my head be like, oh man, it's probably Carthage in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, man. That's probably where the aniconism is, in Alexandria. So it's interesting that even there's no problem, it appears, with the veneration of a cross. And once you come to like the 3rd and then 4th century, 5th century, you have Egeria's diary. This was when she went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and in the environs of Jerusalem, she's going to all the churches and all these different things. So she actually describes one of the liturgies there. And I'm just going to read a quick passage from there. So she says, the bishop, sitting, holds the ends of the sacred wood of the cross firmly in his hands, while the deacons who stand around guard it. It's guarded because the custom is that the people come singly, both faithful and catechumens, and, bowing down at the table, kiss the sacred wood and pass through. And because, I don't know when, someone is said to have bitten off and stolen a piece of the sacred wood, it is thus guarded by the deacons who stand around, lest anyone coming should dare to do so again.
So this is talking about the true cross?
Yes, yeah. So that's the true cross, and from there, once you get into like Holy Week services, it's really just like from Jerusalem the gospel went out. So from Jerusalem, this tradition each year of venerating the cross actually goes into all the churches.
And that's during the quote unquote golden age of the fathers.
Yeah, this is during the golden age of the fathers that Gavin was referring to. So if you and honestly, if you want to read more about like the veneration of crosses in Christian history, there's a great article by Patrick Reagan. It's called The Veneration of the Cross. It's in Between Memory and it's called it's in a book called Between Memory and Hope: Readings on the Liturgical Year. It's published by the Liturgical Press in the year 2000. And if you really want to get in there and you happen to have this volume, it's pages 143 to 153. So again, just the unanimous and ubiquitous practice of venerating crosses. Obviously in Jerusalem it's the true cross. Everywhere else it's a normal cross that they've made with their hands. The kissing in liturgical texts, we see the kissing of the gospel book, and other liturgical items, kissing the sacred vessels, the chalices. Actually, Tertullian has a passage, right, about an image on the chalice, right?
Yeah, he mentions a presbyter who has a chalice that is imaging the Good Shepherd.
Yeah. It's like the shepherd. He says it's the shepherd from the shepherd of Hermas. This is when he's railing against the shepherd of Hermas or whatever. Mm-hmm. And yeah, he says that you have the image of the shepherd from the shepherd of Hermas on your chalice. Yeah. So again, like that's That's really early, man. That's early 3rd century, and already you have chalices with imprinted images of Christ on it. So again, you have this ubiquitous cult of venerating things, and there's nobody.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, and places too, right? There is such thing as with the fathers as sacred spaces, sacred places, places where God's potency is more present than in other spots. So this is why many of the early churches grew up around martyrs' tombs, martyriums. A lot of the early churches were shaped in the round because they were mausoleums. Because these were holy sites. These were sites where miracles could happen, where the presence of the saint could be most felt. Right.
So I think if you were to ask him, ask Gavin, are you willing to adopt these practices, these universal and ubiquitous practices of the early church? And if you're not, why? I think the answer to that question is going to get him into a lot of incoherencies and inconsistencies, because the irony here is that nobody at the Council of Nicaea II represents his view, represents his position. So you're neither represented by the protagonists or the antagonists.
The iconoclasts are wearing vestments, swinging incense, venerating the Eucharist, the whole bit.
Yeah. But claiming apostolic succession, they have bishops.
They have bishops.
So the horse really left his barn, centuries ago. I would argue way back in the 1st century, if you're talking about how you're supposed to properly handle the Eucharist, even. Gavin's real problem, I sense, is actually not with the Council of Nicaea II. I would argue that it's ultimately he has a problem with the Communicatio Idiomatum as it was established by the 4th and 5th and even 6th ecumenical councils. So it's downstream from this rejection of Nicaea II is actually a discomfort with Chalcedon, which even fast forward to the 16th century, even the Lutherans found abhorrent about Reformed theology, that they did not feel comfortable with the Communicatio Idiomatum. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is that?
So, right. So, an example. It's best understood through an example. So, at the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Church decides that Mary, the mother of Jesus, can be referred to as the mother of God. Okay, so the Communicatio Idiomatum, communication of predicates. So, what can be predicated of the Father can be predicated of the Son.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so if we have God the Father, right, that godness, the divinity, is fully in the Son. And so if Mary is Jesus' mother, but Jesus is God, he carries that appellation in truth, then Mary is then the mother of God.
Mm-hmm.
Which I would think that Gavin does not hold to that title for Mary.
Right. And as that works itself out, what you start to see is the language of God died, God bled, God was born, God cried. That's the communication of idioms is the transfer of these types of idioms, so that it's natural to say that God did whatever humans did.
Right.
So the discomfort with that, I think, is where this debate would need to be transferred when talking to Gavin. So I would say that's my second. That's our second challenge to Gavin is this really about icons, or should we take a few steps back? All right, so that brings us to our third, probably main pushback to Gavin. So just to quickly recap, having images is as ancient as anything else that we have about Christianity. Number two, there is an existing and persistent, ubiquitous and unanimous cult of venerating things. within the church's liturgy. Okay. The third point of contention would be the only thing that's really holding back images century over century from being fully included in the cult of veneration was either a Platonic insistence on the incorporeality of God mixed with a semi-subordinationist Christology of many of the early fathers. We'll talk about that. That's number one. Number two is an anachronistic rabbinical view of Old Testament texts, which our channel in our first 500 years series has argued is a huge mistake. And in fact, it's been a huge mistake of many Christians, and especially Protestants, but it has been a huge mistake for many Christians for 1,700 years of the church, at least. So as the church increasingly, corrects course as it's moving through this doctrinal development phase, the corporeality of God in the incarnation really causes this Platonic and rabbinically based objection to melt away, right? In the heat of Johannine and Athanasian and Ignatian flame, apostolic flame.
Yeah. So I would first off, I would back up and I would say that yes, the early church is aniconic. Gavin is correct. Yeah. Many of the earliest fathers are that way, but we have to understand why they're that way. Okay. The real heart of their attack toward idols and the veneration or the worship of idols is this idea that the polytheists are confusing material things with spiritual truths and realities. And so these are false realities. These are deceptive realities. In fact, Clement of Alexandria uses that word. He says they create deceptive art, which, step back first, that might mean there is actually truthful art that can be, created. So idols and idol makers are in the business of deceptive art because they're confusing material with spiritual realities. That's kind of the Platonic influence there. The other problem that they really have with idolatry is that the idols, the statues and the images of the gods, have the ability to attract demons. So there's actually a really potency to them, or a potential potency to them, and that's something that Tertullian would really say, that these idols aren't actually lifeless. They can actually be very, very life-filled with demons, and demons are being supplicated. That's the other issue with the idols. For somebody like Tertullian, he's a little different than some of the other apologists I'll read. But Tertullian is much more focused on the idea of idolatry as false gods.
Right.
He attacks idolatry because these are false gods that are being worshipped. Okay. Not necessarily that a true God could be imaged, perhaps, maybe. He doesn't say that at all. I'm just saying that his idea of idolatry is false gods. But also, he has a broad definition of idolatry. The broad definition of idolatry is, of course, sins. Anytime you're committing certain sins, not being virtuous, you're falling into idolatry. Yeah. So Tertullian, broad sense of idolatry, but also very concentrated sense of these are false gods, and therefore they shouldn't be worshipped and venerated at all.
Right.
And then the third thing would be that honor being paid to a sensible thing, something that you can see and touch, dishonors the purely intelligible, the purely immaterial, which again would be a Platonic kind of twist on things. So those are the major issues. Those are the major issues that the apologists and the early Christian writers have. So I think maybe we can get into some of their specific quotes.
Sure.
So what you're going to see in all of these quotes, whether it's from Clement, Athenagoras, or from Justin Martyr or Origen, is their first and foremost concern is with betraying the incorporeality and the immaterial of the divine, which is, or the ineffability of the divine, which is a Platonic conception of the divine, which is not incorrect, but we would say it's not fully correct, of course. So they're using that kind of, what do I want to say, paradigm to then attack paganism.
And I do want to just real quick before you start reading them, I do want to say that like one of the big motivators behind this is the thing, like we think in terms of like Trinity, right? When you go and read the early church fathers, you have to remember that all of this is very, very primitive. The way that they talk about the relationship of the Godhead is very, very primitive, especially before Nicaea and before Constantinople I. Now, almost unanimously, in the earliest writings of the church of the 2nd and 3rd century, is a tendency towards a kind of semi-subordinationism for Jesus, meaning that Jesus, I gotta be careful how I put these things, but basically that Jesus is subordinate to the Father, okay? In one way or another, and in different ways it shows up throughout fathers, that Jesus is sort of this like subordinate thing. He could be fully divine. He could be, even as Origen says, homoousios, right? Or others who seem to think that Jesus is, a lesser divinity or something. But either way, Jesus is this kind of like, he's on this level and the Father's here. So when they even say the word God, a lot of times in these early fathers, they're talking about the Father. We're used to saying God meaning the Trinity, but that's because we're on this side of all this doctrinal development. But in these early fathers, it's that subordinationism that is keeping them fixated on the incorporeality and the invisibility and the ineffability of God the Father, right?
Or when they're referring to the Son, they keep him transcendent. They refer to him using, he is the Word, he's the reason of God.
Right.
He's Son, not anything carnal, so that he can still be immaterial. And invisible. And
the incarnation is not by no means something that they fixate themselves on, right?
Right. Okay, so this is Justin Martyr, First Apology, chapter 9, and this would be a pretty typical argument. And neither do we honor with many sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities as men have formed and set in shrines and called gods, since we see that these are soulless and dead, and have not the form of God. For we do not consider that God has such a form as some say that they imitate to his honor, but have the names and forms of those wicked demons which have appeared. For why need we tell you, who already know, into what forms the craftsmen, carving and cutting, casting and hammering, fashion the materials, and often out of vessels of dishonor? By merely changing the form, and making the image of the requisite shape, they make what they call a god, which we consider not only senseless, but to even be insulting to God, who, having ineffable glory and form, thus gets his name attached to things that are corruptible and require constant service. What's doubly interesting here, so again, the ineffability of God, he can't be touched, he can't be reached, he's transcendent, and so therefore he can't be represented. What's interesting here is that there's a little bit in Gavin's episode. He kind of overemphasizes how often the fathers use the Decalogue prohibitions against graven images in their arguments. Now, granted, a lot of the Christian writers are writing towards pagans, so they wouldn't really need to always quote the scriptures. But it always seems secondary in their argument. The first argument is, and the more ubiquitous argument, is this one, that God is immaterial, invisible, and of spiritual reality and can't be represented. So that's Justin Martyr. I have to play music as I switch between these sources.
I know, yeah. Interlude. The Jeopardy music would be perfect.
So let's see. Clement of Alexandria, Exhortation to the Greeks. Or the heathens. Oh, that's better.
Heathens is good. We should revive the word heathens.
Heathens 4. So God is perceived by the mind alone. So Clement of Alexandria, he uses poets and philosophers. In this instance, he uses the prophetess from the Sibylline prophetess Sibyl, and quotes the pagan prophetess, who said, "Not the oracular lie of Phoebus, whom silly men called God and falsely termed prophet, but the oracles of the great God, who was not made by men's hands, like dumb idols of sculptured stone." So one of the tropes that the early Christian apologists are using are the tropes that educated pagans elsewhere were using against the senseless idols. He then goes on to quote Heraclitus, who says, "And to these images they pray with the same result as if one were talking to walls." Okay. Then he goes on and says this, "But images, being motionless, inert, senseless, are bound, nailed, glued, melted, filed, sawed, polished, carved. The senseless earth is dishonored by the maker of images, who change it by their art from its proper nature, and induce men to worship it. And the makers of gods worship not gods and demons, but in my view earth and art, which go to make up images. For in sooth, the image is only dead matter, shaped by the craftsman's hand. But we have no sensible image of sensible matter, but an image that is perceived by the mind alone, God who alone is truly God." So the other interesting thing, so God can only be perceived by the mind. He can't be imaged with dead matter. And then you also see the idea of God being dishonored in the shaping of the craftsman. The idea there is that God is a creator. So, the craftsman is just at best a stupid imitation of what God is in creating. All right. And then Clement of Alexandria again in Stromata 5:5, where he argues visible images impair and steal honor from the invisible. He writes, and again, quote, "Don't wear a ring nor engrave on it the images of the gods," enjoins Pythagoras. "As Moses ages before and acted expressly, that neither a graven, nor molten, nor molded, nor painted likeness should be made, so that we may not cleave to things of sense, but pass to intellectual objects. For familiarity with the sight disparages the reverence of what is divine, and to worship that which is immaterial by matter is to dishonor it by sense." So he gets into a little bit of trouble, because then he knows he's got to talk about the brazen serpent and the cherubim, right? Mm-hmm. So he's in reference to the cherubim. "But it signifies the repose which dwells with the adoring spirits, which are meant by the cherubim. For he who prohibited the making of a graven image would never himself have made an actual image in the likeness of holy things." So what ends up happening here is that Clement of Alexandria rationalizes away the actual existence of the cherubim in the temple. He allegorizes it and spiritualizes it, and they never really existed. In other words, they were there in the scriptures as a symbol to us, but not actually within the temple itself. Which is his Platonism is leading him to that kind of conclusion.
Right, exactly. And I hope that through these quotes that people are seeing that it's not, this isn't coming from a uniquely Christian argument. That in many ways, and especially in that last quote, what you have is the Platonism of this particular church father is getting the best of his Christianity. Because even just to talk about God like that, especially on this side of, like, say, Chalcedon, even to my ears, just sounds like, well, wait a minute, but what about the incarnation?
Well, if that sounds a little odd to you, right? If that sounds a little odd to you, then certainly Athenagoras will sound odd. He says in his plea for the Christians, chapter 15, "But grant that they acknowledge the same. What then? Because the multitude, who cannot distinguish between matter and God, or see how great is the interval which lies between them, praise to idols made of matter. Are we therefore who do distinguish and separate the uncreated and the created, that which is and that which is not, and that which is apprehended by the understanding and that which is perceived by the senses, and to give the fitting name to each of them? Are we to come and worship images? If indeed matter and God are the same, two names for one thing, then certainly in not regarding stocks and stones, gold and silver as gods, we are guilty of impiety. And he goes on and on. The point being that for him there's a great chasm between the ineffable God and matter, which again is true, but not fully true.
It's only true if your only focus is talking about the Father. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like the Son, what's missing here, from our eyes is, where's the Son in all of this? Where is the incarnation of the Son of God? Which again, we're not going to place on these early fathers, though, right? We're not going to press that on them anachronistically, because that's not their game right now. It will become their game as time goes on. As people start making very false claims about the Son, the church is going to have to pivot and start talking about the Son.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so then we'll go to Origen. Origen in against Celsus. He quotes Heraclitus as well. That is childish folly for one to offer prayer to images, whilst he knows not who the gods and heroes are. We reply that it is easy to know that God and the only begotten Son of God, and those whom God has honored with the title of God, and who partake of his divine nature, are very different from all the gods of the nations, which are demons. But it is not possible at the same time to know God and to address prayers to images. He then says, moreover, we do not imagine that these images are representations of God, for they cannot represent a being who is invisible and incorporeal. But as Celsus supposes that we fall into a contradiction, whilst on the one hand we say that God has not a human form, and on the other we profess to believe that God made man in image of himself, and created man the image of God, our answer is the same as has been given already, that we hold the resemblance to God to be preserved in the reasonable soul, which is formed to virtue. So right there, you would have, Chalcedonian would have right there gone to the incarnation.
Right, yeah, exactly. Right.
You're almost expecting it as a Christian when you're reading Origen, for him to say, they might come back at us and say, well, but isn't your God a man? No, that's not what he does. He goes, he goes back to Genesis, like, but you guys are created in the image of God, right? And he says, well, yeah, the reasonable soul, which is, again, invisible and immaterial. So the big point here is that for many of these early Christian writers, it's their Platonism that they're using to attack idolatry and idols. So this material culture is coming at them and saying the gods are represented by the idols, or the god is present with the idol, or the god, whatever. The idol is recognized to be a symbol for the god, whatever it may be. The easy trope is to pull from the philosophers and say, but God is invisible. And
they're trying to win. They're trying to win the pagans, right?
Right. They're trying to win. Right. Exactly. So the context here is paganism. The context here is the worship of false gods, not true gods. And the problem are images of those false gods.
Right.
So that's really the obviously true context of this aniconism of the early church.
In the context of an underdeveloped Christology.
Yeah.
Like,
but also to honor what they've received, what they think they've received from the Jews. So we said that they're really actually receiving rabbinic understanding of the Old Testament. Right.
So in our first 500-year series on our channel, if you're listening to this, we've dealt with like Old Testament religion, Israelitism, and when you get into the Second Temple Jewish phase of Israelite religion, it's way more diverse than you really think. And really what you have coming out of the destruction of the temple, the Bar Kokhba revolt, after that, what you really see is this, we've said, a Y-shaped movement. It's not an R-shaped movement. It's not like, here's Judaism, it's going, and then all of a sudden Christianity breaks off. It's there's all these Judaisms, and slowly they're starting to fall off until finally you have the rabbinicism going this way and Christianity going this way, and they're both pulling from the Israelitism and the Yahwism that pre-existed them. And each of them are taking with them different aspects of the cult. So don't forget that the first temple, you can go to actually our what episode was that where we actually took a tour of both temples and we showed like visuals of that, whatever. I think it was John. I think it was John and the secrets of the temple, Jesus and the secrets of the temple in the Johannine tradition, and we walked through both temples just to show you the stark difference between these two. The first temple of Solomon, which God gave all the orders for and everything, is just full of images and carved images and lights and incense, all these different things. The second temple, you can see that like something drastic has happened here. It's very aniconic, nothing going on, like in there. So what that showed us was that like a gradual change in the official cult of Israel had taken place. However, you still had all of these other forms of Judaism happening, these other forms of Israelite religion happening that were not as aniconic at all. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, so that by the time that you get to this phase of the fathers, like what we're reading in the late 2nd, early 3rd, and 4th, and 5th, and 6th centuries, they are so far removed in time from that era of debate, that intramural debate in Israelite religion, that it almost becomes a shorthand for them to get to the religion of the apostles and the religion of Jesus, to sort of assume that the rabbinical view of aniconism was actually what Jesus's religion was actually what the
we have, and that's not, we're not just saying that. Origen is famous for having a Hebrew teacher, and he would go to him and discuss with him the scriptures and how you interpret the scripture and all of that. And so when the apologists are referencing the Decalogue and the prohibitions against graven images and those, they're really just they're just adopting typical tropes, Jewish tropes.
Yes.
Because again, if you're not allowed to make a likeness of anything in heaven or on earth, at the same time, Christians are making likenesses of things that are in heaven and earth all over the place.
Yeah.
So you can kind of tell it's just a polemical tool, and a lot of times more rhetorical and hyperbolic than actual real argument.
We called this in our episode like temple tension. That like there is a tension between the first and second temple. Just come out and say it, and it shows up in the texts. I mean, this is why for St. Paul, there's this big emphasis on the faith of Abraham. We are of Abraham's faith, and Moses in St. Paul's writings is sort of becomes a figure that is associated with this kind of emergent or nascent rabbinicism that is going to arise. These kind of Sadducean and Pharisaic parties. So you have to see that like that temple tension is kind of lost on a lot of the fathers in a way, right? They're not picking up on a lot of those things. So the aniconism of the rabbis, they themselves are anachronistically reading into the Old Testament texts when all over the Old Testament. That's why they're having to deal with these weird texts. The bronze serpent, the bronze serpent gets destroyed, in prep for the second temple. But Jesus says, like, dude, I was the bronze serpent. That was me. So he refers back to it and says that was a symbol of me. And then we also went through the book of Revelation and how all the things that are getting restored in the temple is actually the Solomonic symbols, not the second temple symbols. So again, a lot of this stuff is getting lost on some of these fathers, and so they're kind of being anachronistic in adopting a kind of rabbinical view of the Old Testament.
But this has a real effect on everyday Christians though too. The Platonism is getting in the way even of contemplation. So many Christians, like Origen, like Athenagoras, like Evagrius, like Theophilus, many of these Christians taught that when you're in contemplation, when you're praying, that you should not have any image before you at all, mental image at all. You have to work to empty completely your mind, because that's the only way to see God in your soul, because he is ineffable, he's imageless. And so imagery is actually obstructive, according to Origen, according to an Evagrius. It's obstructive to contemplation. It's in the way. And we know that Origen is no lover of the resurrection of the flesh, right?
Our spherical bodies.
Yeah. So even mental images are being brushed aside by some of these apologists. Now, Gavin would not agree with that.
Right.
So clearly their Platonic tendencies are getting in the way even of their cult. Because that's not going to be how most Christians pray. Down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So the point being that the excesses of Platonism that even Protestants are always kind of complaining about when they go back and read the texts of the early fathers, the irony here is that those excesses of Platonism actually end up getting a shellacking at Nicaea too. And Protestants like Gavin seem to still not be happy about this, right? And I think that actually is a tell in a way, right? Because I think that reveals something. It's because Protestantism ideologically has also always assumed rabbinical Judaism as a guide to understanding the faith of Jesus and the apostles, and especially the Old Testament, which is exactly why they, in the 16th century, even ended up adopting the rabbinical canon of Scripture.
Yeah.
So Nicaea, too, is just as much a referendum on the excesses of Christian Platonism and the errors of the rabbis in the patristic era as it was an assertion of Christological orthodoxy in the light of these 6 councils that just took place. Yeah. You know, it's important to point that out, that almost all of Gavin's patristic quotes, which he has a lot of them, you know, he's going through and it's very effective. Like his argument is very effective because you're reading like, oh man, like leading up to Nicaea 2, where the heck does Nicaea 2 come from then, you know? But it's important to point out that almost all of his patristic quotes against the making of images, it displays actually a patristic aversion that is couched in either kind of this rabbinical or more common, this Platonic and not specifically Christian argument, you know?
Yeah.
So, and furthermore, you know, in a lot of these later instances too, that he ends up quoting, when he's actually quoting intramural Christian debates and they're not just like addressing pagans in this golden age of the fathers, the writers are bemoaning something that's actually happening in Christian churches. And as historians, you know, as an apologist, you're going to be like, see, look, he's condemning it. But as historians, you look at that and you say, well, it sounds like this practice is pretty ubiquitous in the churches and some church writers are pretty mad about it, right? So that at the very least, what it does is it puts on the ground the practice of venerating images and having images and all these things squarely within the realm of historic Christian piety, right? Even if any given Platonically informed patristic writer is scoffing at it at any given moment, you know? So I think like this is where, for me, this is where like his methodology comes into question. It's problematic for me because he seems in his video to treat the word of any given patristic writer as more important than kind of a collective voice of piety that's happening among the faithful. Not that it's, again, I'm not going to make too much out of what's going on the ground, but it's there, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be writing against it. And the church, the Catholic Church, always considers what's going on the ground and judges that as an interplay with what the writers are saying, you know? So the church doesn't merely consider itself in continuity with the fathers, but it considers itself in continuity with the communion of saints as a whole.
The sensus fidelium.
Yeah. So it's like any you know, savvy student of church history, you know, you quickly realize that the hierarchy and the imperial powers were just as often promulgating ideas that the Christian masses refused to accept as they were, other times promulgating orthodoxy. So before the hierarchs were, even during the Nestorian controversy, before the hierarchs were scandalized by what Nestorius was doing, it was the crowds that were running through the streets and marching and saying Theotokos, Theotokos, outside of the Council of Theotokos, Theotokos. So this is the methodological concern that I have in the ecclesiological concern, is that the church is more than just the eye or the brain, right? It's hands, feet, it's everything else as well. And as a Protestant, I can understand why Gavin would methodologically gravitate to the writers and what they're saying, because Protestantism tends to be this more anthropomorphic or anthropocentric iteration of Christianity and focused on the naked word, like the word is king, right? So that's why they gravitate to writers. Mm-hmm. But historic Catholicism is always a religion of word and cult, so we're always considering the interplay between both, right?
And to the cult, we're saying that this is a development in cult. So what does that first development look like? So I mentioned that because of these Platonic attacks on idols by Christians, they also give us what their cult is like, these writers. And their cult is aniconic as well. Their prayer life is aniconic in their minds. Okay? In their minds, they want to get rid of images.
Yeah.
A shift and a check on that cult occurs with Saint Athanasius. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for where are developments in the cult, this is when it happens, Gavin. You have Christians who are using Platonism against idolatry to put the cult in only one line of contemplation, and that is completely imageless mental prayer. Mm-hmm. Okay? With Athanasius, we could say that there's a triumph of what I would say mental icons, the triumph of mental icons.
Yeah.
And Athanasius makes it okay to image God in your mind, the Son of God in your mind, as a way of understanding and knowing the ineffable God. So seeing as a way of knowing in St. Athanasius. And he too is pulling on the tradition of the church. Mm-hmm. And it's really him who checks this kind of Platonic understanding of prayer that's there. So in these, I have two good quotes from, obviously, his famous On the Incarnation. And in them, you'll see that he's saying that mentally beholding the Son, one can behold the invisible Father, and then the mental image participates in the prototype. And so what happens, what we can say is that the Athanasian turn is that instead of images being an obstruction to God in prayer, as an Origen would say, that actually becomes a tutor in contemplation and in prayer. All right.
And just as you're saying that, before you read, like literally in my mind as a Christian, I'm thinking, Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and he is the image of the imageless God. Like literally as you're saying, so it's like, man, Athanasius to me is like, he's getting on point here,
Right. He's correcting the tradition.
Yeah.
So on the Incarnation.
Yeah.
On the Incarnation 14. For men missed seeing this before and have turned their eyes no longer upward but downward. So he's talking about revelation. Yeah. They missed it. And so men's hearts are turned downward to the earth. Whence naturally, willing to profit men, he sojourns here as man, Jesus, taking to himself a body, like others, and from things of earth, that is, by the works of his body, he teaches them, so that they who would not know him from his providence and rule over all things may even from the works done by his actual body know the word of God which is in the body, and through him know the Father. On the Incarnation 15 and 16. Foreseeing that men, having rejected the contemplation of God, and with their eyes downward, as though sunk in the deep, were seeking about for God in nature and in the world of sense, feigning gods for themselves of mortal men and demons. So he's talking about idols. Mm-hmm. To this end, the loving and general Savior of all, the Word of God, takes to himself a body, and as man walks among men, and meets the senses of all men halfway. To the end, I say, that they who think that God is corporeal may from what the Lord effects by his body perceive the truth, and through him recognize the Father. So, men as they were, and human in all their thoughts, on whatever objects they fixed their senses, there they saw themselves met halfway, and taught the truth from every side, basically from knowing Christ's ministry and imaging his ministry. For men's mind, having finally fallen to things of sense, the Word disguised himself by appearing in a body, that he might, as man, transfer men to himself, and center their senses on himself, and men seeing him thenceforth as man, persuade them by the works he did, that he is not man only, but also God, and the Word, and wisdom of the true God. End quote. So he's talking about contemplation. He's talking about the mind, that Jesus in his body, because we were fixed on the earth, he came to the earth. And he's now, through his body, through the things he has done, as we contemplate those things in our prayer, he's lifting us up to know the Father. Mm-hmm. So now we know the context of the famous quote from St. Basil on the Holy Spirit, chapter 18. St. Basil says, "We do not fritter away the theology in a divided plurality, because one form, so to say, united in the invariableness of the Godhead, is beheld in God the Father and in God the only begotten. For the Son is in the Father, and the Father is in the Son. Since such as is the latter, such is the former, and such as is the former, such is the latter, and herein is the unity. So that according to the distinction of persons, both are one in one, and according to the community of nature, one. How then, if one in one, are there not two gods? Because we speak of a king, and of a king's image, and not of two kings. The majesty is not cloven in two, nor the glory divided. The sovereignty and authority over us is one, and so the doxology ascribed by us is not plural but one, because the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. Now what in one case the image is by reason of imitation, then in the other case the Son is by nature. And as in works of art, the likeness is dependent on the form, so in the case of the divine and uncompounded nature, the union consists in the communion of the Godhead." So he's using representational art to prove a point, and the point is that when we contemplate Jesus, a figure in our minds, when we contemplate his ministry, when we look on the walls of the churches and we see didactically the things that he is doing, and in our mind we have an icon of him, that will lead us to the Father, who is ineffable. That's the second part that you never heard from an Origen, from a Clement of Alexandria.
Exactly.
There's a slight but a serious correction happening from Athanasius and onward.
Yeah.
That is marking out a development in the cult.
Yes. Yeah, it's recentering Christian theology in the Christ event.
Right. And so, in other words, icons of the mind can be venerated. Right. Jesus in the mind can be venerated.
Yeah.
So now images in the, though albeit spiritual, in the soul, in the mind, are there and adored.
And I can hear right now though, like a Protestant, like stop like listening to that and saying, "Oh, please, like I know where you're going with this or whatever." But I would invite them to maybe put the guard down for a second and really just think about that. That like when they do pray, do you put an image of Jesus into your mind when you're doing it? And then the question is that what Jesus looks like? Is that, you could start giving all like the stuff, but right. That is significant to think about that, because the previous fathers, for them, it was get to the incorporeality, get past image. Yep. Don't even think about image. That's a hindrance for you. Whereas this is now a new, like you're saying, this Athanasian shift is saying, no. that image, you want that always before you in your mind, because that is exactly what leads you to the Father.
Yep, and to know Him. So, so for as long as the church would continue to work, primarily through a Platonic lens in their conception of God, they would mimic that kind of philosophical disdain toward religious images, right? Kind of in defense of that Second Temple aniconic religiosity inherited from Judaism. But with St. Athanasius, it became uncomfortable and challenging for the church to think of God as merely incorporeal.
That's right.
As merely invisible, as merely spiritual. Athanasius had this kind of profound insight into the incarnation. Something like Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch also had that insight. And so there's a defense of the divinity of the incarnate Word that begins to allow the church to assert things that somebody like Origen or Clement would have never really said. And that is the communicatio idiomatum.
That's right.
So,
significant too that Athanasius is also centered in Alexandria, right? Because so is Origen, so is Clement. So you can see him trying to right the ship, perhaps, of his own context also helped bleed out into this massive, empire-wide controversy.
And again, it's not just, we're not just saying these things. We know a shift is taking place here within the cult of prayer. And it shows forth, there's an immediate impact on the ground to what St. Athanasius is saying on the Incarnation. And that impact is that any scholar will tell you that Christian art, religious images, go from narrative to portrait in the 4th century. All of a sudden, after Athanasius, after Nicaea, we start to see portraits show up in Christian art, which is super, super significant.
Yeah.
Because all over the ancient world, in Greco-Roman society, a portrait meant veneration. A portrait meant adoration.
Yeah.
Okay? No matter where you were, there were portraits. In your house, as a Roman, you had masks of your ancestors, portraits of them looking at you. Okay? Anywhere you stepped out of your house, statues of the emperor, portraits looking at you. Everywhere you go. A portrait means something different than mere narrative.
Yeah.
Because a portrait is intimate, it's looking directly at you, and it garners a response from you. Okay? So, I like the quote from Robin Jensen in her newest book, From Idols to Icons, where she says this: portraits have special functions and power. They serve to represent a being, whether mortal or divine, rather than illustrate a story or symbolize an idea. By presenting the model's face to the viewer's gaze, they engage the viewer in a distinct manner, making eye contact, as it were, and even seeming to look back at the viewer. This prompts the viewer to address them, or to feel affection or fear, for instance, as if the images were actually the persons they portrayed. Encountering a model's portrait face-to-face is entirely different than looking at a narrative image depicting a historical episode or mythological scene, as pleasing, inspiring, or edifying as that might be. The engagement with a portrait can be distinctly intimate and personal.
And the Romans had narrative and portrait art, right? That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
and nobody was venerating the narrative art.
But that gets to a point. When Christians begin creating portraits of the saints and of Christ and of Mary in the 4th century, it's not like paganism is gone.
Right.
The majority of the empire is still pagan. The majority of the empire is still polytheist. The majority of the empire are still idol worshippers.
Yes.
Images are still everywhere. Even when Constantine dedicates Constantinople, he brings with him pagan idols all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So Christians knew the power of portrait, and yet they still created them.
Mm-hmm.
And they still started to create them because of what Athanasius had said, because of that tradition, that the incarnation makes that possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So a great example would be in the Catacomb of Peter and Marcellinus in Rome. It's a 4th century fresco on the ceiling. And it shows Jesus with the apostles who are literally pointing you to Jesus on the throne, literally directing your gaze to Jesus on the throne. And so you start to see images like this pop up all over the place. And eventually, within a century, they'll be in the very apses of churches.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's be reasonable here. You tell me, you're going to walk into a church and an icon of Jesus is staring you right in the face as you're praying the liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Right.
telling me you're not going to recognize that image? You're not going to be praying while you're looking at that image?
You're not going to use it. You're not going to use that.
You're going to
image.
use the image to contemplate.
Exactly.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. Because that's what portraits are for.
That's what they're for. Exactly. It's to aid the viewer in their mental apprehension of the divine. That's what it's for.
Right. So, images now are that tutor and no longer the obstacle that they once were. That's the slight switch. Then we see it from a switch from narrative to portrait. Okay. Now go back to that story. I think Gavin relates it in the episode of Eusebius, right?
Yeah.
Where he's talking about the statue of Jesus and the hemorrhaging woman, right? Let's go back and read that. So Eusebius writes, "The woman with a hemorrhage, who, as we learn from the Holy Gospels, was cured of her trouble by our Savior, was stated to have come from here. Her house was pointed out in the city, and a wonderful memorial of the benefit the Savior conferred upon her was still there. On a tall stone base at the gates of her house stood a bronze statue of a woman, resting on one knee and resembling a suppliant with arms outstretched. Facing this was another of the same material, an upright figure of a man with a double cloak, neatly draped over his shoulders, and his hand stretched out to the woman. Near his feet on the stone slab grew an exotic plant, which climbed up to the hem of the bronze cloak and served as a remedy for the illnesses of every kind. This statue, which was said to resemble the features of Jesus, was still there in my own time, so that I saw it with my own eyes when I resided in the city. It is not at all surprising that Gentiles who long ago received such benefits from our Savior should have expressed their gratitude thus. For the features of his apostles Paul and Peter, and indeed of Christ himself, have been preserved in colored portraits, which I have examined. How could it be otherwise, when the ancients habitually followed their own Gentile custom of honoring them as saviors in this uninhibited way?" So here's Eusebius talking about what seems to be a long-standing tradition of having a statue of Jesus, but also images, portraits of Paul and Peter and of Christ himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that these images have been honored by Christians, basically. But he's also, there's derision here. He's saying, well, yeah, they must have been recent converts, recent Gentile converts, and they don't know any better. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of elitism there with Eusebius. Mm-hmm. And Eusebius is a man who would follow Origen in the idea of you can't image the ineffable and so on and so forth.
Right. But what's funny about that is that he's 4th century, right? And so if I were a Protestant, I would totally I'd quote that and I'd say, see, it's Christians don't do this. He's kind of just saying this was a Gentile thing, whatever. But in the same century, you also have the Cappadocian Fathers. You have references to statues in the churches.
Yep.
You have a reference to a statue in the church in St. John Chrysostom in his homilies. It's homilies on Ephesians, homily 10, where he says he's basically talking about like, you guys don't come to church and the fire of divine grace is here, right? So he says, for like a conflagration indeed, or like a thunderbolt hurled from on high, have they lighted upon the roof of the church, and yet they rouse up no one. But whilst our Father's house is burning, we are sleeping, as it were, a deep and stupid sleep. And yet who is there whom this fire does not touch? Which of the statues that stand in the church? Okay, so he's literally referring to statues in the church. And I think it's Gregory of Nyssa has another reference to it too, right?
I think it's Nazianzus has a reference to...
It's the oration on his father's funeral.
His father's funeral.
Yeah.
Where his father had built this church, basically, and dedicated it and adorned it. And in there, he references statues that are all around in the church.
Yeah. I just want to see if I have it real quick, if I have it up. If not, then at least people know it's in his oration on his father's funeral. Yeah, I don't have it up, but yeah, it's in there.
Yeah, and then so now we can say all this. Like Robin Jensen could say, "Oh yeah, portraits mean something different." In other words, what do they mean? They mean that art is beginning to go from didactic to devotional. Mm-hmm. So the move was first. We have images. The second move was we can have images in our mind to contemplate the ineffable. Images of Christ, his ministry, what he has done for us. We can
have devotional image, right? It's not
devotional
just narrative.
Image.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Devotional image and adore Christ in our minds. And then it becomes we have portraits that are being used devotionally. Okay, in our devotions. So it goes from didactic to devotional art very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. Then it goes to holy. So in St. John Chrysostom's homily on Meletius, the bishop, he says that people started naming all their children after Meletius. Everybody wanted to honor him by doing that. There's honor in the name. Beyond that, he says that Christians started making rings and images and whatever else.
Paintings all over their walls of their homes.
Paintings all over their walls of this saint to bring them consolation because he had died. But he calls the images holy. Images, sacred images. Mm-hmm. In the span of 200 years, Origen would never have said there is such thing as holy images.
Right.
Clement of Alexandria would never have said there is such thing as holy images. Mm-hmm. But St. John Chrysostom, in the golden age of the patristic fathers, has no problem saying that these images are holy objects.
Right.
And what do people do with holy objects? We have shown they venerate them.
Right.
So there's a very thin line between devotional use of images and veneration. So you're seeing the grades. You should be seeing the grades. You should be seeing a cultic development that's taking place as you move from the 3rd to the 4th to the 5th centuries.
And again, if the precursor to this, all of the objections to images in the pre-Nicene fathers was that these are unholy, that these are demonic, these are polluting, profane, corrupting,
and that they can only attract demons.
Yeah, that they can only attract exactly. They cannot be holy. They have no potential for being holy. You see that, and like you said, paganism's still there, right? So you can see that what they're doing is they're contrasting. They're not saying like you can't even have images. What are you doing? They're saying there's a difference between a set apart image, a sacred image, and that garbage. you know.
Well, but also truth and falsehood.
Yeah.
So these are
true image and false image.
These are images of true things and not images of false things. So a lot of the the polemic in the earliest fathers against idols was that they were false. They represent
and therefore the
false
artificer
beings.
was wasting his time even, like, because it's like, that doesn't exist. Why are you spending so much time even making it? Whereas Christ exists, the saints exist. They're true, And there's
So,
even
no.
then. Go ahead. Yeah.
No,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and then that's why, like, when you move into, what's that instance where they're commanded to take all the images out of the church, and they don't even destroy them? What is that? Because that shows you too that, like, they recognize that these are sacred images and not profane ones, because they don't break them, they hide them.
Yeah, it's Gavin references it. I don't know the exact reference, but yeah, the story is that he found they had images of angels which they destroyed, and then images of Christ and Mary that he didn't destroy. He just kind of hid away so that they wouldn't use them, which kind of admits that these are different kind of images. These
iconoclasts or these aniconic Christians who wanted to remove the images from the church, they knew that it was almost awkward. They were like, well, what do we do with them? I'm not going to destroy them because they're not profane.
Right.
Yeah. So
now this is not to say that everybody's venerating images in the 4th century. We're not saying that, or even the 5th century, which actually they may have been already. But because there are still fathers like Saint Augustine, who again is Platonic in many ways, who advises against images on account of the pagans might think we're worshiping them. Okay, so a lot of times with Augustine, it's in relation to something else. So yeah, we don't worship images because the pagans might think that we are like them, and we don't want that. Or the Manichaeans attack Christians for worshiping images of the saints and portraits of the saints. But again, there's that philosophical background there to the Manichaeans that matter is bad, and so Augustine has to try and answer that safely to bring a rebuttal to it.
Right.
But there's other instances where Augustine is quite aware of images in the churches and honor being paid to them. Okay, he may not like it, but he's just one man.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that is his opinion, right? But it's formed against this this foil that it's happening. The veneration of images is happening.
It's beginning to happen. Yeah.
It's starting, right? So stepping back for a second, then think about this. What then hinders us from giving a nod, to an image of Christ walking into the church, to a genuflect, to light a candle in front of it, to even a kissing it, especially what the kiss meant in ancient cultures. Christianity especially is a kissing culture. They're kissing crosses, like we said. They're kissing gospel books. They're kissing relics. So they're kissing each other, in the context of the liturgy. So it's like, we just kiss an image of the Savior as we go into the church or as we're processing through the streets or whatever it is. It's just perfect. It's natural. In other words, it's not like they're like forcing this here and there. It's a perfectly wholesome, comely, and natural outward act of piety, as contrasted with all these pagan practices. Now, take that and you compare it to what's all of a sudden arising when you come to the 7th century and you have Islam, which is not only aniconic, but is iconoclastic and is literally destroying churches, destroying icons, right? And then taxing Christians who even have icons in their churches. And so then some Christians start to remove icons from churches. And then before you know it, it becomes an ideology, too, that they're adopting and saying, wait a minute, And it's because of this, once again, this sneaky this sneaky idea that God is so incorporeal,
so transcendent,
and so transcendent. Yeah. We even said in like our Pope Benedict episode that like Islam thinks that God is so transcendent that he even transcends reason, so that it's all about will, right? And that's why violence tends to characterize the faith in its earliest days. So to see then now from this context to look over after the Athanasian, developments, after the Christological developments, and after, this is just perfectly natural. This again, kissing and outward respect showing culture of the church. To then see and hear Christians plastering over images of Jesus, breaking them, not even the quote unquote like people who were suspicious of icons back in the time of Gregory the Great, when they're removing icons from the church, they didn't even have the guts to break them, Mm-hmm. But these guys are breaking them publicly in the streets. They're even excommunicating members of their own flocks for doing something that everyone is naturally doing. Now the church looks and says, that's not right. That's not what we received, right? Like even just to have images is perfectly fine, So the innovators are squarely these iconoclasts. Mm-hmm. In this narrative. Yeah. So that is the context leading up to the Council of Nicaea II. That's the stage that is set for this big controversy to get embroiled. And Gavin's right, it gets ugly, as everything does. But I mean, come on. I mean, the Protestant Reformation was ugly. Okay, you want to talk about the people who were getting burned in Geneva? I mean, that's history.
Yeah,
okay?
that's just shock value stuff. Yeah.
That's human sin, and he did do that quite a bit. He likes to throw in some shock value. This is people gouging out their eyes and cutting off tongues and all. Yeah, so was the Reformation. Okay, like let's get to the meat, right? So, with that in mind, I do just want to read certain parts of the Council of Nicaea. I have it up in front of me. So, so it starts off with just like, the normal stuff, the grace of God and the emperor has, called this together and everything. And then what it does is it just recounts. It's funny because what it does is it recounts all the formulations of the 6 councils. So after it recounts that, though, here's what it says. It says, to summarize, we declare that we defend, free from any innovations, all the written and unwritten ecclesiastical traditions that have been entrusted to us. One of these, listen to this now. So this is what they're attributing to the apostolic generation. One of these is the production of representational art. This is quite in harmony with the history of the spread of the gospel, as it provides confirmation that the becoming man of the Word of God was real and not just imaginary, and as it brings us a similar benefit. For things that mutually illustrate one another undoubtedly possess one another's message. Given this state of affairs and stepping out as though on the royal highway, following as we are the God-spoken teaching of our Holy Fathers and the tradition of the Catholic Church, for we recognize that this tradition comes from what? The Holy Spirit that dwells in the church. See, so this is where they're making the switch to now we're going to talk about this veneration thing. This is of the Holy Spirit. This is in the church age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We decree with full precision and care that, like the figure of the honored and life-giving cross and the revered and holy images, whether painted or made of mosaic or of other suitable material, are to be exposed in the holy churches of God, on sacred instruments and vestments, on walls and panels, in houses and by public ways. These are the images of, and he goes, our Lord, our Savior, Jesus Christ, the Lord, Our Lady without blemish, the saints, the angels, okay? But then this is when it gets into the veneration part. So he says, the more frequently they are seen in representational art, the more are those who see them drawn to remember and long for those who serve as models, and to pay these images the tribute of salutation and respectful veneration. They're saying, salutation, like just paying respect to the image, right? Certainly, this is not the full adoration in accordance with our faith, which is properly and paid only to the divine nature. but it resembles that given to the figure of the honored and life-giving cross, and also to the holy books of the Gospels, and to the other sacred cult objects. Further, people are drawn to honor these images with the offering of incense and lights, as was piously established by ancient custom. Indeed, the honor paid to an image traverses it, reaching the model, and he who venerates the image venerates the person represented in that image. So it is that the teaching of our Holy Fathers is strengthened, namely that the tradition of the Catholic Church, which has received the gospel from one end of the earth to the other. So it is that we really follow Paul, and he starts going through, like, talking about the principles that led them to this point.
Yeah.
You know? So they're saying it right there. It's not even like mine and your thesis. Like, they're saying
now I'm mad because we spent all this time. We could have just read that.
Well, this is what it says. So therefore, all those who dare to
could have just read the counsel. We could have just ended the episode.
I know, yeah. Therefore, all those who dare to think or teach anything different, or who follow the accursed heretics in rejecting ecclesiastical traditions, or who devise innovations. See, this is where Gavin was like, innovations? This is the unanimous consent of the fathers. Like, no, it is innovations because nobody was destroying images. Nobody was plastering over Jesus' face, in the churches. Who spurn anything entrusted to the church, right? And then it actually says they treat these images as profane. And that's the innovation right there. Why are you doing that? No one's ever done that, right?
Yep. Yeah, I'm a little jealous too because he's talking about. We just realize how aniconic our own culture is, and we project that onto the past.
Yes.
He's talking about put up the images in the causeways in the out in public, and wouldn't that be great to see?
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. And this actually takes us to the issue of nominalism, like the scholastic issue, the high medieval scholastic issue of nominalism, which is that sharp separation. It again, it was because of this revival of Aristotelianism and stuff, but it's this sharp divorce between what was immanent and what was transcendent, and everything that was divine and human, immaterial and material. Yeah. So it's like me asking a holy person, for instance, to earnestly pray for me, like, doesn't negate the glory of God. Actually, Bishop Barron has done a great job of this too, talking about the Reformation, where he says, like, there's this competitive grid on which Protestantism lives, where it's like, in order for me to get more glory, or a saint to get more glory, God has to get less of it,
Well, that's ironic, because that was one of the arguments of the early church fathers, is that when you give honor to a sensible thing, it takes away honor from God.
Right. And that's that pagan philosophy getting the better of them, me lighting a candle in front of an icon as I pray to God doesn't detract from God's glory. Right. Me kissing a cross or an icon as a symbol of, deep respect and love doesn't negate my worship of God, or take away something that belongs to him. It's like, and this is what I personally had to leave behind when I was a Protestant. It was like this I felt like I was suffocating. It was like this constant cultic straitjacket, an allergy to beauty and bodily piety. It's an absolutely overstated allergy to anything that smacks of what they consider to be popery, but it's even something as ancient and apostolic as praying for the dead, which even the Protestant C.S. Lewis said was the most loving and natural thing that a person can do for a loved one who passed away. It's like around every corner in Protestantism was this illogical and overstated restriction on historic and wholesome piety. If I had to choose between two evils, I would choose the space where apostolic piety is permitted to express itself alongside unfortunate abuses, rather than the space where restrictions are so tight that even the apostolic and ancient piety is snuffed out, and forbidden.
Yeah. And that occurs, right? There are certainly abuses among Orthodox and Catholics when it comes to images. We've witnessed it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when we were in a chapel one time as Protestants in a Catholic church, and there was this material out from the Blue Army. It's talking about the Fatima
traveling statue,
the traveling Fatima statue, and the way that this thing was talking about it was like, that's not right. That's not even what the Council of Nicaea II is saying. It was saying and it is believed that Mary's presence travels with this statue, like specifically. And it's like,
yeah, and it was awkwardly giving her pronouns, like, oh,
yeah,
she,
they changed
as she enters the church, we bow down to her, and yeah, that's an abuse of Nicaea too.
Right. So like, and so Gavin did a follow-up video to like Trent Horn, and he said that he went through a lot of this, like his pastoral concern about this whole thing, and
which I get.
I totally understand that, and I agree with his pastoral sentiment. I'm not the type of Catholic who turns a blind eye to abuses in this area. It bothers me.
If meat causes my brother to sin, I'll never eat meat again.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a sense in which Catholic prudence and catechesis definitely ought to improve. And I would say, especially on the Orthodox side, catechesis ought to improve there, because I've known many Orthodox as well. So the thing, though, is that the misuse of a good doesn't negate its proper use. That's just a basic rule, of logic, right? So, like, the proper use of Nicaea II is good. Mm-hmm. So you don't throw it out just because certain people will abuse it, and even certain hierarchs will abuse it. I cling to the definitions of the council as it says it, Mm-hmm. And for me, the cost of making Christianity an aniconic religion would be too great. Because it'll eventually come for the sacraments.
Yeah.
It eventually will come for ordination. If the priest isn't an icon of Christ anymore, right? Like, mm-hmm. it'll ultimately accelerate secularization of the public square.
Which Reformation has done.
Yeah, this is demonstrably what the Reformation has done. Protestant aniconism has accelerated so far the secularization of space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is why, and that's why it's so ironic when people are just like skipping off to Europe to see the great cathedrals and see like angels in the architecture of even these secular buildings. I mean, Nicaea II Christified the world. Mm-hmm. This definition right here permitted the Christification of the entire world. It really did.
Well, it permitted culture. It permitted culture.
Culture, right.
In the real sense of that term.
Yeah. And so that's why in the conclusion to all of this, I think I appreciate Gavin's arguments. I appreciate everything, but I hope that this at least gives the alternative view and the alternative interpretation of history and the sources. And it also demonstrates some of the maybe unwitting, but the real dangers of aniconism and an aniconic Christianity.